Conversations from the World of Allergy, a podcast produced by the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology. I am your host, Rebecca Sapp. I am a board-certified allergist and immunologist and a fellowship director who always enjoys learning more about the exciting field of allergy immunology. Our podcast series will use interviews with thought leaders to keep up to date on new developments and to review core topics. Today, we are pleased to welcome the president of the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology, Dr. Frank Virant, to the podcast. Dr. Virant was a partner at the Northwest Asthma and Allergy Center and directed the clinical and research laboratories there. He also served as the chief of the allergy division at Seattle Children's Hospital and was a clinical professor of pediatrics and the associate director of the Allergy Immunology Training Program at the University of Washington School of Medicine before retiring in 2024. He has been a longtime leader in the field, serving as president of the Washington State Society of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology and as president of the Trans-Pacific Allergy and Immunology Society. In the Quad AI, he served a number of roles, including chair of the Sinusitis Committee, before serving on the board, and now as president. Dr. Virant, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rebecca.
I'd like to just start by getting to know you a little better. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself and maybe include something you like to do outside of medicine?
Yeah, of course. So basically, I grew up in Seattle and actually stayed through college. I was a chemistry and physics major. I ended up going to med school in St. Louis, where I met my future wife, Terry. And then I decided to go back to Seattle to do pediatrics. And while I was there, as we'll probably talk about later, became very interested in the field of immunology in general and eventually allergy specifically. As you mentioned, I practiced at Northwest Asthma and Allergy for close to 40 years. And during that time, I was also allergy chief at Children's and part of the AAAAI program. Outside of medicine, I love spending time with my family. Just in speaking with other people, it's somewhat unusual that all three of our children are still in Seattle with their significant others, and we have 4 grandkids. Up until recently, I used to play a lot of basketball and even hardball, baseball. I do like playing golf now, and I'm starting to get into photography in terms of not just taking the pictures, but framing them as gifts and things like that. So it's been fun.
That's wonderful. It's good to have your family close by. I hope I can convince my family to all stay around.
Yeah, that's right. Well, some of it, as you can imagine, is luck of the draw with jobs, etc. But it has been nice.
Well, what made you choose allergy immunology as a field?
Yeah, that's a good question. I always have to start by answering that question by saying, in retrospect, I grew up with horrendous allergies. I was a chronic mouth breather, and of course, at the time, I had no idea what was going on. Although I vividly remember my TNA at age 6. That was pretty gruesome, but helpful. But I think really, as I was doing my pediatric residency, at that time at least, we had the model of every doctor in the division of pediatrics was susceptible to being an attending on the wards, regardless of specialty. And as an intern, I was fortunate to have exposure to Dr. Hans Ochs and also Dr. Ralph Wedgwood. They were kind of administrating the immunology division, and I was impressed not just with what they did every day, but how they thought about patients in terms of, why is this particular patient in front of us today? Is the diagnosis really right? And but I became fascinated by the field of immunology, which was just evolving, I would say. I mean, I think we had T-cell growth factor, which turned out to be IL-2. It was very rudimentary. Very few, CD designations were known at the time. And so after PEDS, I ended up doing immunology, but got frustrated ultimately by writing grants that were approved but not funded, competing with Tony Fauci with HIV projects, probably. And we had our first child. So I decided to kind of cover the bases and finish doing an immunology fellowship as well as allergy. So I could actually sit for the boards, and, the rest is history. I sort of got got involved with the local group, and it went from there.
Absolutely. Do you see differences in what you saw on the wards back when you were training versus now in terms of
Oh,
diagnoses and severity of diagnoses?
oh yeah, absolutely. As you can guess, this was in the early 80s. Even when I was walking around seeing patients with Dr. Ox, he basically had an intuition for, we're missing something here, but nobody quite knew why this patient was immunodeficient. As you know, we didn't really have a lot of treatments beyond bone marrow transplants probably, and that didn't happen very much, or IVIG. And now it's truly amazing the large number of genetically defined immunodeficiencies and at least several new therapies as well. Kind of dovetailing that, well, more in the allergy asthma vein. I was reflecting on this the other day. It's we didn't even have inhaled steroids till the late 80s, and I remember dreading being on call from November through March, right? Especially at Seattle Children's, so you'd get 10 admissions a night if you were lucky, of these poor asthmatic kids. That it was like a roller coaster. They'd go from one viral URI to another. Obviously, viruses remain a trigger, but it's pretty remarkable what we have in terms of controller medicines, and now even with biologics for severe patients. It's well, it probably speaks for itself. Our group at Northwest Asthma and Allergy used to keep a tattered notebook of admissions, and typically we would, and this was before hospitalists, we'd have 700 admissions a year, clustered during the fall and winter, and we would attend on them. And I remember very distinctly, like even 20 years ago, that number had dropped to under 20.
Wow.
And it's, obviously there's still today people that don't have the adequate access to care, ability to get or stay on the maintenance meds and so forth. So there's still patients who slip through the cracks, but pretty remarkable that it's really should be just an outpatient disease now.
Absolutely. Yeah, we see
Yeah.
many fewer asthma patients in the hospital, just, a
Mhm.
handful, and usually during the height of the flu season or the RSV season.
Right, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah,
so pretty amazing.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you officially began your presidency at the Quad AI WAO Joint Congress in San Diego in February.
Mhm.
How has the
Yes.
presidency been what you were expecting, and what has been surprising?
Yeah, I think it's pretty much what I had expected. This is my 7th year on the board. I sort of did a regular 4-year stint, if you will, as an at-large member, and much like Paul Williams, decided to run for secretary treasurer, et cetera. And so I had a pretty not only good notion, but some great role models through the years as far as how to do this. A spectrum, I suppose, of people, but I had a pretty good idea, and it's been pretty much that. The most surprising thing, I suppose, has just been this step up in what's been needed as far as advocacy, as far as trying to combat the proposed NIH. Well, obviously, as you know, multiple grants have just been stopped, but trying to combat that and try to work with Congress members and so forth, especially those involved with appropriations, to really look at this is not the right way to balance the federal budget. You need to think, and also focusing on all the positives of what NIH funded research has done, if that's not obvious to people over the last 20 plus years. uh, I
Yeah,
mean,
even just
I think
discussing the
close.
asthma treatment that you were just discussing, what
Yes,
we've been able to advance
yes,
is incredible.
yeah. I mean, I think the number is something like 462 out of 470 approved medications have come through NIH funded research. And the other, sad part of that, and we've tried to publicize that because I think patient stories, unless you're heartless, really should make you step back and think, boy. So these are people that some of them are on cancer protocols, and the study's been stopped. And so it becomes not only potentially life-threatening for that patient, it makes, it makes the research impossible to evaluate because it doesn't gone through the appropriate completion. So, I want to say, and some of this has been primary things that we've sent to Congress members. A lot of it's been sign on with, multiple other organizations. And I think we've made some headway. I mean, a good example is one of the eosinophilic disease grants was sort of abruptly stopped. And fortunately, I think we've made headway where at least that can be redone. And those researchers don't have to wait several years, which would obviously be impossible, really. So I think we're pressing on, but that has, I want to say, almost every other day. It's been that level. And we've, of course, always been involved with advocacy. CMS related issues remain an important issue with trying to combat basically, as you know, physicians basically are operating on a 1998 level of funding, versus it's kind of strange that it's the only branch there. In other words, that isn't true for hospital-based reimbursement. That has included a cost of living, but strangely, that has not been the case. So that's hopefully we can make some headway there. But that's the biggest surprise, I'd say, is just in the level of what's been really needed.
Absolutely. And, with the NIH comes its impact on the generation of scientists coming behind us who are
Yes.
looking to the NIH for funding, and, so discouraging to see all the hard work that they've put into these fantastic ideas and time and energy,
Yes.
getting their career going, and then just having that, disappointment that the funding's not available.
Yes. Well, and we're hopeful, and you'll hear more about this, but we're hopeful through the foundation to try to, especially, I was just looking at a spreadsheet yesterday, and not surprisingly, 95% of the targeted cuts have been to R01s, and especially, just people, just getting started, or they didn't quite get started yet, to see if through the foundation we can help at least some of the people in our field that have been affected. So it's daunting, but the other interesting thing with that is I'm reading more and more about Europe and other areas like Japan they're actively pursuing researchers from here to move.
We do have fantastic
which is,
researchers here.
yeah, exactly. So, but it's frustrating because literally will take an act of Congress to change some of these things, but it's just frustrating, obviously, that politics seem to outweigh common sense. And
Well, certainly I've appreciated the work that the Quad AI has put into really advocating for our scientists and for funding for them. It's
good,
great.
good.
And you've served in a number of different leadership roles
Yeah.
at all different levels,
Mhm.
the state, regionally, and now nationally. What really got you
Yeah.
serving in this way, kind of at these different levels?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, probably a couple different things. At the local level, quite frankly, it was sort of, this is what happened if you were a new allergist. In other words, I see you've just joined Northwest Asthma and Allergy. Well, we'd like you to be secretary treasurer of the regional, society. And that meant 8 years of going on to running the program, et cetera, and being president. It's kind of getting your feet wet, I suppose. Having said that, it was a great way to, I guess you could say forcibly, if you weren't going to do it yourself, really get to know your peers, not just the people you practice with, but regionally, and so forth. The other, the other part of it is, I think Well, let's put it this way. I was raised in a practice where, what you do is you get involved with committees at the academy level and, an area of your interest, and that will lead to, potentially giving talks about it, end up, publishing and so forth. And you really become a local expert, which is a fun thing to do. And, I think it also kind of, because of that, people look up to you as someone to potentially lead. And so I think it was sort of a self-fulfilling thing. I know originally, beyond the local part, I was involved with the Trans-Pacific Society, which was an interesting combination of clinicians from Japan, Australia, and Western U.S. And it was a great opportunity. It was a small organization, but a great opportunity to see how often economics affected how you treated patients. For example, nebulizers were $1,200 in Japan at the time. So it spawned this whole industry of, creating oral mediator blockers that we never even had in the US, just as an example. And I think that, again, was a smaller group. So I became interested and involved and kind of rose to the presidency there. Similarly, Bill Pearson in our group, who was president of the Academy in '91, in concert with others, helped found what is now the foundation. It was called the Educational and Research Trust, and very much appreciated his passion and I think foresight in producing new researchers, academicians who would take over those programs where the program director was retiring. So that's how I became involved in the foundation, and ultimately, at least for a couple of years, being the chair of the foundation. And then over the years, as my career pressed on, I've always wanted to be involved with the board. And I had the opportunity one of my fellows actually took my position as associate program director, so it allowed me a lot more time to get involved at the board level. And then, as I mentioned before, just being on the board, I really wanted to do what I'm doing now, as serving as president, kind of giving back, and it's been a wonderful journey.
I think especially hearing about how other countries are treating allergy and immunology diseases must have been fascinating. Just the difference in costs,
Yes.
which we don't necessarily think about, or the
Yes.
ways that we approach things can be so differently for the same disease.
No, absolutely. And again, this was at a time where we're just on the cusp of inhaled steroids, but even before that, I was like, what is this medicine? When I went to Tokyo for one of our meetings, and we kind of moved the meetings, around from Hawaii to Japan and Australia, and yeah, just really fascinating.
Yeah, that's a very unique organization. I feel like we don't
It
have as
is.
many of those that are cross.
No, exactly. I mean, sadly, well, not sadly, that's not right. But I think at the time we had the sort of early innings of the World Allergy Organization, and it just wasn't possible for the Academy to help fund the Trans-Pacific anymore. And so it kind of gradually, died, so to speak. But it was a wonderful regional thing. Large region, I guess.
And large region. And it sounds like you've had some fantastic mentors over the years, and mentors can be so important
Yes.
for providing us with
Yeah.
guidance and support. Can you tell us about some mentors that you've had who've really influenced your career?
Yeah, absolutely. I sort of alluded to one earlier, and that was Dr. Hans Ochs, who, a few years back, one of my internal medicine colleagues at the U in allergy asked me to give a little presentation every year on Sunday, as a lot of, regional areas do. We have kind of a get together at a restaurant, and so I did a little presentation on this very subject, like who are your most important mentors, and what did you learn from them? And as I said, from Dr. Ox, it was really questioning, like, why is this patient here? And sometimes it's very obvious, but sometimes not so much. And you start like, well, how many times have they been here for this? And, you know, thinking in terms of the immunodeficiency line, I suppose. But then also with just sort of regular ward patients, this patient's on 5 medicines for asthma, or whatever, as an example, and, they're not allergic, they don't have reflux, they don't have sinus disease. Are we sure that this is right? And it's things that sometimes you see a patient with almost blinders, and it's been billed to you as here you go, and it's not right. And so it's not something you necessarily spend a lot of time, but it's really, throughout my career, made me ask that question, at least briefly, like, something's not right here, that sort of thing. And then probably the other two main people, I'd have to say several people in my group, not just because I trained with them, but literally worked elbow to elbow with them. And again, Bill Pearson and also Gail Shapiro, who I was fortunate my office was right next to hers. And again, it was this: get involved with the academy. You'll develop a network of wonderful friends you wouldn't meet otherwise, develop a special interest, and then separately do clinical research, which has always been a big part of our practice. Give lectures, write manuscripts. You do this, and a lot of that was them often passing opportunities on to me, and probably see how I would respond to those opportunities. But it's obvious, if you're going to give lectures and write manuscripts, you better know what you're doing, and it really informs you, kind of in a subliminal way, how you interact with patients. How you teach them, how you get them to be compliant, and so forth. And their advice was, you'll really be at the top of your game. It'll enrich your clinical experience in your career, and you'll be able to help patients more. And so I think those are, probably the three main people that I would point to.
So much of having a mentor and being a mentor is being able to pass on those opportunities that really help
Yes.
you to grow your mentee. And it sounds like you had some great examples of that.
Yes. Well, and it really, in retrospect, helped guide me a bit when I, was working with fellows and so forth too, of like, well, I wish somebody had told me this, or, rather than learning it the hard way, kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, every president has initiatives that are put forward. When did you start thinking about the initiatives that you wanted to promote?
Yeah, I think probably during my second tenure on the board, knowing where this was all heading. And part of it was, I guess, driven by my personal experience, some of the frustrations in, of course, the pandemic didn't help, but in the early 21, 22 years of seeing how difficult it was to maintain, even though we had probably one of the largest, AI groups in the country outside of an academic center. It's tough. There are a lot of things going on in medicine that, you really had to fight through to get adequate reimbursement for what you were doing. It was hard to recruit new staff. We lost a lot of staff. And then I think in the decade or so before that, I think a lot of us weren't aware of how in tune we needed to be with technology, of upgrading EMRs and the business side of medicine. So that's why one of my major initiatives is try to get, more people that are in practice to get some expert advice about how to make their practice more efficient and, quite frankly, survive. And so as you know, the last several years, we've had a practice management workshop during the summers, but that, it's been well received. And it just struck me we could do this on part of a day during the annual meeting. And people that are, almost every practice is going to have one or two people there anyway. And so that's one of my initiatives. So, and that's already in place with the AMPC. So Friday of next year's meeting in Philadelphia, we'll have about a 5-hour session that kind of runs up into the presidential plenary, kind of highlighting what I hope will be the best of of those workshops, practice matters, etc. And then we decided to do a little mini session. It's just a couple highlighting things like coding and negotiating contracts for the fellows in training, and even the NIA group members that are interested. And that'll be after, they as you know, both groups have their own programming on Friday as well, but this will be after the presidential plenary on Friday.
That's great.
So,
I think that as a program director, I sometimes forget about the business of medicine and making sure
that's
my
right.
fellows know about. I'm so focused on making sure they know the
Yeah,
pathophysiology and the treatment and the evidence behind what we do that sometimes I think
yeah,
we forget about the business of medicine that is so important to just having a practice survive and thrive. One of the initiatives you've put forward is increasing the awareness of allergy immunology,
yes,
particularly amongst primary care practitioners. And so, all the incredible things we can do for patients, sometimes the primary care field isn't aware of that. What
right.
are the ways that you're planning on kind of sharing the good news of what we can do for primary care?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is something that struck me when very often I was giving talks at the AAP section on allergy and or larger, even a plenary session. I was impressed that people didn't understand that their mindset was, well, I don't think this patient has any allergies. They do have sinus disease and they have asthma. You know, are you the person to really see them? In other words, they would probably tend to go with ENT or pulmonary, which is fine, I suppose. But I think just conveying the notion of, because allergy plays such an important underlying role in a lot of what we see every day, we get used to, helping patients where when we look at that, it turns out they have no allergies. They often have eosinophilic, non-allergic disease, but we get used to dealing with that and treating it. And I think that, as well as perhaps emphasizing a little more the immunodeficiency piece, especially since we have better diagnostics and potential therapies now, but also kind of dovetailing with your earlier question, it's been interesting over the last 20 years that I practiced how much more we're seeing of things that, quite frankly, often have little to do with allergy, like chronic spontaneous urticaria and or angioedema, eosinophilic GI disease, and obviously some of those patients might have allergy. But these are, disorders that have other drivers at the epithelial level that, again, are perceived, in a way that I can see that there wouldn't be a mindset that as specialists we would be the ones to see those patients and help them. And so as far as getting the word out, I think I was just speaking, a couple of my colleagues, Anju Peters and Rebecca Schertzer, are kind of working on, we've actually interviewed a lot of other thought leaders, I suppose you could call them, with how, the best way to get this out. And I think what I'm hoping to develop is a kind of a trifold little brochure that, of course, will be electronically available. This is something that, and I'm going to call it something like, how can the AI specialist help? And sort of emphasizing some of these beyond the obvious things with food allergy and hay fever and so forth, emphasizing some of these other areas where our members could have in their waiting room, because obviously the patients are already there, but often patients will talk to neighbors, et cetera, and kind of get the word out that way. The other thing that we're hoping to do is develop, and we may end up doing, expert videos on some of these topics like adverse drug reactions that could be embedded as a QR code if somebody's giving a lecture to a group of family docs or a group of pediatricians or a group of internists. I know really throughout my career, and maybe people don't do this quite as much, but I used to give a lot of lectures at lunchtime to a group of pediatricians, and they'd ask me to talk, well, tell me what's going on with food allergy, and I'd start with that, but kind of come full circle, and we'd start to talk about other patients, and very often just at that grassroots level, people would begin to realize what else we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've mentioned how much practice has changed over time and the kind of rapid acceleration of how practice is changing. And so one of the things you've put forth is the kind of living practice parameters, that so often it goes
Yes.
10 years between when we see practice, guidelines, and then 10 years before we see the update. And in that time, so many things have changed. I know that the atopic dermatitis practice parameters are kind of put forward as an example, and they're certainly fantastic. How do you see this working, where
Yes.
we get these more rapid updates in our guidelines?
Yeah, that literally is a work in progress. So I've sort of tasked Marcus Shaker, just because he's been involved with the Joint Task Force and continues to be. He's our sort of liaison as a board member. And so we're actually using the atopic dermatitis as I guess you could say, a guinea pig for how to do this going forward with every new update that's happening, but also taking a look at, and it's something, in other words, if something's in the queue for 2 years from now, that we probably won't go after that. But if, let's say, there's a new rhinosinusitis parameter, when any of the sort of grade guidelines are developed of actually having a tail on them for at least 5 years, where there's somebody at McMaster's, Derek Chu, who is just been amazing, and a lot of the work that their group has been doing with the parameters. But he will actually kind of use AI and a few other techniques to look for new diagnostics or therapeutics in all of these grade parameters. So not just the current one in progress, but ones where it's been a few years, and actually begin updating all of these. My hope is that, and the Joint Task Force will be meeting actually with the journal editors in a couple of months, that these will get published as addenda. There's some politics there, but probably whoever did the whether it was the Annals or JCI in practice, whoever did the initial guideline would be the person or publisher doing the addenda. But also to publish the fact that these are published to third-party payers, because I'm hopeful. You can't force people to do things, but I know, again, in practice, there's always a lot of pushback with things that are new, and they're labeled experimental, and there's not even a prior auth thing you can jump through to get it approved for your patients. That this is something that our members could point to and no, this is now how we practice taking care of this disease, and hopefully fight through some of that as far as getting adequate coverage.
Yeah, that's really helpful, because so often these things are so new that they get rejected automatically. And then having that evidence, no, this is going to become a part of our general practice because the evidence is so good, I think will be really helpful.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your focus on improving the pipeline for allergy
Sure.
immunology. I know that's been a focus. What are some of the ways you're looking at kind of improving the pipeline into allergy immunology?
Yeah, I think, well, I can also speak to something that, that I've brought up. Actually, met a couple times with the program directors, kind of offering up the notion of, before your fellows leave you, and obviously it depends on where those fellows are ending up, but really emphasizing the notion of, giving back in the sense of having residents rotate through their practice if that's appropriate. Like in our case, obviously we're involved with our fellows as well. But as far as the pipeline, getting involved with med students, residents, and you have to have enough support to make that happen. And I think it's a win-win. I know for several of my nearly 40 years, we very often met with the Seattle Children's Program Director. And most of them, especially if they were allergic, I guess, were very receptive to, hey, a general pediatrician, this is going to be affecting probably a third of their day at some level. And so it became sort of a win-win of we actually had every resident rotate through our offices and get exposure to patients, and and really several of those people, they told us later it really influenced my, like, why I wanted to be a fellow. The other thing is, as you know, personally, the Chrysalis program has been remarkably successful, and we're going to expand that for this next year. The difficulty, or I guess elephant in the room, is we need to be able to train more people also, because I think we're already getting a pretty exuberant response based on the number of people that are trying to, and we're, I think, pretty much fully matched with the spots that we have.
Which is
It's
great
kind of,
news that
it
the
is,
word has gotten
yes,
out about what a great fit.
yes. So I think the front end, there's also something called the ROAR program, which is kind of something that David Kahn and his group in Texas started, a kind of a similar idea of not just having people rotate through the offices, but actually having a half or full day thing for local primary care residents to just kind of both educate but jazz them up with the idea of being an allergy immunologist. I think that's been quite successful, and we've sponsored kind of similar programs back east and also in California, and we're going to be looking. It's hard to often know. You have to actually talk to residents directly and see how things develop over time. How much did that influence you, or were you already on that track? But it's another example of a program just to try to increase interest. But I think, we're trying to think of some other creative ways to try to be able to fund more spots.
Yeah, the funding for fellowship slots, increasing that would be fantastic. A more challenging time to get the increased funding right now, but
Yeah,
hopefully in
yes,
the
yeah,
future we can continue to train, given how important it is in keeping our patients healthy. So,
yeah, absolutely.
and now looking back, what advice would you give to physicians who are just starting out in the field?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, to be honest, I've tried to do this over the last 15 years or so, is to get involved with the academy in an area of your interest. So much like the advice I was given 30 some years ago, to be perfectly honest, and I'm speaking like some of the practice regionally in our area, it's been challenging. I think some of the younger people, just out of training, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but maybe they have a better sense of work-life balance, I suppose, or whatever. They just are a little more reluctant to get involved. But I think that's very important to have a, sort of, I guess, a second family outside of your practice family. If it's possible, depending on where your practice is, again, get involved with teaching and mentoring, even clinical research. That's getting a little harder to do now. But I think my sense is that even now, though, it really can take you beyond a simple, I guess it's no longer 9 to 5. I guess it's more like 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. practice with EMR. But yeah, it's really pretty similar advice to the advice I was given, I guess.
I think sometimes when we think about burnout, we think about how to get more time outside of our job. But so
Yes,
much of our love of our job and our joy comes from interacting with our colleagues in places like the Quad AI and the state and regional societies, interacting with students and with trainees because of the kind of enthusiasm and questions they bring, that even though it is
yes,
more work, it really just brings back your enthusiasm and your joy for your field. So I 100% agree.
yeah, no, exactly. So I think with that in mind, and you'll hear more about this probably over the next several months, but we have a lot of new strategic plan initiatives that are, by definition, this is over a 3-year, 4-year period. But we've already made some good, inroads, I think, in that of trying to provide a more personalized experience for members, based on their intersection involvement, committee involvement, and also trying to improve, quite frankly, the onboarding experience. I think it's wonderful. I was joking the other day that we have FITS and we have NIA, that we should have like a mature allergy group or something. But trying to develop things that would be helpful for our members at every career stage.
I
And
think
I
that's
think
wonderful.
a big part of that is, we've hired a couple new communications people to really look at what we have, which I know is pretty woefully inadequate right now, but really see what we need, make it happen, not uniquely to the academy, but looking at how AI can play an important role in getting that done, and hopefully in a beneficial way.
Absolutely. Well, I'll put a plug in for the Quad AI Leadership Institute, which I did,
Yes.
and it's how I
Yeah.
got involved with Chrysalis. That was my Quad AI leadership
Interesting.
project, and then I
Yeah.
went on to become a part of the working group, and now I've co-chaired it the last couple of years, and just so much
Yeah.
fun to see people coming into the field and the enthusiasm of these medical students and residents, and the great people I've gotten to
Yeah.
work with. So
Well, and
definitely,
yes,
these programs make a difference.
yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the Leadership Institute, because it was actually helpful even to me, because for a period of a few years, especially with, I was involved with the first couple permutations of the sinusitis parameters, and quite involved until we got more help at the fellowship level, and as far as running that when I finally was able to turn over some of that, I actually went to the leadership program and talked to a few people, including Jim Lee, and quite frankly, that's how I sort of got back into everything, because I
Great.
had I had been less involved. And yeah, it's really wonderful to see. I mean, as president, you get to put your blessing on proposed new committee members. It's nice to see. I wish it could be even more, but it's nice to see a high percentage of these are new, not their NIA members and so forth. So I think we're getting there as far as establishing the track to the future.
Well, I just want to thank you
Yeah,
for taking the time to chat with me today. I'm excited to see what you accomplish
yeah,
in the next year and what you establish that will go forward and reap rewards in the future.
yeah. Well, thank you very much. It's been great to be here.
We hope you enjoyed listening to today's episode. As a reminder, this podcast is not intended to provide any individual medical advice to our listeners. We do hope that our conversations provide evidence based information. Any questions pertaining to one's own health should always be discussed with their personal physician. The Find an Allergist search engine on the Academy website is a useful tool to locate a listing of board-certified allergists in your area. Use of this audio program is subject to the American Academy of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology Terms of Use Agreement, which you can find at quadai.org. Please visit quadai.org for show notes or any pertinent links from today's conversation. If you like the show, please take a moment to rate and subscribe wherever you download your podcast. Thank you again for listening.